Starmer is reaching new lows. His polling is at rock bottom, as is Labour's as a whole, and it just seems to be getting worse and worse for this disastrous government. But the funniest thing about all of this is that Labour are doing absolutely everything they can to recover. They are trying to put into place what appear to be popular policies to get the populace back on side, but it all just keeps on backfiring, leading the media to now officially declare, as you can see here, that Starmer has a reverse Midas touch. Of course, infamously and biblically, King Midas could touch anything and turn it into gold. And, over the last few decades, that's evolved into the idea that someone who just breathes and oozes success, anything they touch turns into something successful. A businessman wants to start up a new company, well, it's obviously going to be successful because that businessman has the Midas touch. Well, Keir Starmer, everything he touches turns into the single most unpopular policy in British history, and it tanks his approval ratings even further. Now, obviously, what spurred this very specific video on here right today is Labour and their adoption of Blair's digital ID policy, making it mandatory for everyone, which is supposedly in some weird roundabout way supposed to stop illegal immigration, because if I already have a passport and a driver's license and a national insurance number, and my company has a VAT number, and I've got an NHS number and all these other forms of identification, well, the thing that's really going to stop illegal immigration and those people from crossing the channel on the boats is me now having a digital ID as well. Now, this is obviously ludicrous, and it's now one of the most hated policies that the Labour Party and Starmer have announced so far in their short yet disastrous tenure as our government. So buckle in, because this video is going to be actually a little bit lighthearted and a little bit funny. And yes, there are some very serious problem here at play. Digital IDs are genuinely a little bit worrying and very, very Orwellian, and it will lead us down a dark, dark path. So we should be opposing it with everything we have. But I am going to try and keep this video a little bit lighthearted, because mostly this is just me enjoying myself, laughing at the downfall of one of Britain's now most notorious and hated socialists. And so we're going to be covering why Labour and why the Starmer, authority basically thought that this would be a home run, why this would be a popular policy in their mind, and why it failed so catastrophically, along with looking at a couple of their other reverse Midas touch moments to establish why he has this reverse Midas touch and why it isn't just limited to digital ID and how it goes far, far beyond that. So let's get right into it. Now let's start by establishing where this digital ID policy and story all starts with, and maybe that will give us a bit more of an idea as to where the reverse Midas touch came from for this specific policy. So the digital ID story starts 20 years ago, 25, 30 years ago with Blair. And he basically had a policy back then for national identity cards. These are present in a load of other countries in the world, in particular in Europe. They're really, really common. And obviously one of the big projects, the pet projects of Blair, was to turn the UK from a slightly right-leaning state into a very left-wing institutionalized state like you see in Europe. And so a part of that was national identity cards. Blair wanted to bring them over from the Channel into the UK. And he also wanted to add in on top of just the national identity cards, which most European nations have, to some biometric additions as well. So that national identity card, it would be tied to your DNA, or maybe your blood type or your fingerprints, just to make sure that it's difficult to build one and to use one fraudulently, because we can't fake digital fingerprints, but we can fake, physical driver licenses and things. Now this was back when the economy was falling apart under the global financial crisis, and frankly Labour just ended up with other priorities, and so they never really got around to implementing this specific policy, these national identity cards. And then when the Conservatives came into power, they just decided to scrap the policy altogether. We then didn't really hear about it or didn't think about it, and the media didn't really push for it. There weren't really think tanks out there saying that this would be a great thing to improve our country for the best part of 15 years. That was until Keir came into power, and he is really the spiritual successor to Tony Blair, or actually just the literal successor to Tony Blair. He's the next Labour Prime Minister since Blair left, and he also very, very distinctly supports a slow creep towards socialism, towards authoritarianism, towards the lawyerification, if that's a word, or the solicitation, no, that's a separate word, the act of turning the UK into a country run by lawyers of the United Kingdom. That's something he distinctly supports. And so when everything is run by lawyers and democracy doesn't really exist anymore, well, that's when Keir is finally happy and content with his project. So it's no surprise that he hired a load of people who used to work for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister, like his Chief of Staff. The exact same people who were turning the UK into a state run by lawyers then, and are now continuing this process of turning the UK into a state run entirely by lawyers. And obviously then, it stands to reason and it follows that Tony Blair's old policies have started to pop up in this new Labour administration in an attempt to harness that new Labour popularity. So in June of 2025, we started to get inklings that maybe a digital ID was coming for us. And it started with a More in Common poll, or a survey that was commissioned by someone that took a look at people in the country and just saw, are you pro a digital ID, or a mandatory digital ID that everyone could have, that could replace driving licenses and passports and things just for ID on a domestic basis? And actually, the polling came back pretty positive. Only 19% of the country, of the people who were surveyed for this poll, were opposed to a digital ID card, and about 53% of voters surveyed said they were actually in favour of this policy. So what did we see next? Well, Starmer jumps on this poll and he sets out plans to roll out a national digital ID scheme. This is now a few weeks old, a couple of months old, this article actually, before this whole, catastrophe started. Why did Starmer jump on this as such an instant opportunity? Because this is a really, really popular policy according to this poll. 53% in favour, while only 19% are opposed, is really popular and is something that almost any party would jump on and go for. The problem is that once Starmer announces that this is his policy, well, now a new poll is taken and it finds that everyone's kind of changed their minds already. Just 31% of the people surveyed after Starmer's announcement over the weekend said that they were supportive of the scheme, with now 45% saying that they were opposed, and of those, 32% were strongly opposed. More than 2.6 million people then went on to sign a petition against the introduction of this mandatory digital ID within just 1 week of the policy being announced. And that is a 47% swing purely based on Starmer touching this policy and turn it to shit with his reverse Midas touch. And that's, let's not forget, after Starmer tried to hijack this policy to claim that it will fix the illegal immigration crisis and would stop the boats and would make the country safer. And so this is really quite an incredible ability to destroy the public opinion of something simply by relating it to his name and his toxic brand. But actually, this isn't the first time that this has happened, and I think the best other example for Starmer's reverse Midas touch is with the rape gang inquiry that Starmer and the Labour Party opposed for literally months on end. Now, this was a massively favourable policy to have a full nationwide rape gang inquiry that was boosting the polling of every party that were pushing for it in the media very, very substantially. And eventually, Labour were, of course, first avoiding this national inquiry, saying that they had a local inquiry and that was sufficient. But then the local inquiry came back and said that they have to do a national inquiry because this rape gang problem is so comprehensive and just covers so many different regions in the UK. And so Labour U-turn and they switch around, and then they announce that they're also in favour of that policy of doing a national inquiry and that they're actually going to push forward and do it. Well, you would be forgiven then for expecting Starmer jumping on this really, really popular policy for the whole country to rejoice around it and to celebrate him doing it and for his polling to actually go up. But the problem behind this, and the reason that didn't happen, is that Starmer was doing what we all had wanted and begged him to do for 6 months. That didn't actually make him popular. It made him less popular because he had already spent 6 months saying that he wasn't going to do it at first and that we were unreasonable for asking for a national inquiry. And then he changed his mind. And so it showed off two sides to Starmer that everyone innately, deep down inside themselves, absolutely hates. Number one, Starmer doesn't have any opinions or policies or ideas himself. He simply does what he thinks is popular, and he panders to people and lacks a spine and a backbone and just any innate character. And it showed also, the second reason this was such an unpopular thing for him to do, to U-turn here, was that it proved that he was wrong for the first 6 months of denying that national inquiry, which simply meant that we were 6 months behind where we should have been. And so by refusing to just grow some balls and just to state what he really thinks, Starmer managed to alienate absolute everyone, and his polling went down after announcing this very popular policy of a national inquiry. Now, there are loads of other examples of almost the exact same thing happening here as well, with winter fuel payments, which was actually more in support of than opposed before Labour announced it as a policy. Then they announced it as a policy, and suddenly the whole country goes against Labour and they start disliking what they're doing. The exact same happened for reducing that PIP payment as well, right? But once Starmer made it his policy, everyone who hates Starmer, which is most people, they suddenly hated the policy as well. So why does this reverse Midas touch exist, and can Starmer get rid of it? Well, no, because Starmer governs and he communicates purely on deception. He is never honest in an interview. He uses prepared lines which have been worked out by his crappy little interns in an office and lawyers days before that interview ever happens, and he never ever strays from those lines. He basically refuses to govern with honesty and integrity. And again, digital ID is a perfect example of this. This here is basically the government's announcement that they're going to be putting out this digital ID scheme, telling you what it's going to be about and justifying it as well. Now, in general, the government is sat here claiming that this digital ID is going to stop illegal immigrants coming to the UK, and that's why they're putting it into place. Digital ID will be mandatory as a means of proving your right to work. This will stop those with no right to be here from being able to find work, curbing their prospect of earning money, one of the key pull factors for people who come to the UK illegally. It will send a clear message that if you come here illegally, you'll not be able to work, deterring people from making these dangerous journeys. Now, let's be perfectly clear. I am entirely in favour of making it difficult and stopping illegal immigrants from working in the United Kingdom. But this isn't how you do that. The way you do that is you just implement a new law which says every illegal immigrant that your business hires or employs that we catch, you have to pay a £100,000 mandatory fine. And guess what? We're going to send out the police and they're going to get a 5% commission of that fine. Suddenly, every single police officer in the country just goes on Deliveroo, orders a takeaway that night, and then when the illegal immigrant comes to deliver it to them, they arrest them, they report it, Deliveroo has to pay a £100,000 fine, and the police officer gets a £5,000 bonus on top of stopping an illegal immigrant from working. At the end of the day, that is how you stop them from working. You just send the police out to enforce it. The truth is that it's actually already a requirement for employers to check that any new employees they have the legal right to work in the UK, right? But businesses who employ them, they just don't do the checks. Or they do the checks and then they allow the illegal immigrants to get around them anyway. So having this new digital ID scheme isn't going to stop that from happening. The employers who want to hire someone for less than minimum wage, like Deliveroo, who are employing thousands of illegal immigrants every single day, well, they're just going to continue to allow these illegal immigrants to circumvent the rules and continue to work despite the digital ID. How does a company like Deliveroo actually get around this? Well, it's really simple, right? There's a person with a legal right to work in the UK and they set up a Deliveroo account and they say, hey, I'm going to be delivering for you. And then that person with the account, they rent it to an illegal immigrant for about £50 a week, and then the illegal immigrant actually does the deliveries and they get most of their money. And boom, suddenly they're getting around these legal checks. Technically, Deliveroo is doing what they're supposed to do legally, and a digital ID isn't going to stop that at all, right? If there's a car wash which is hiring illegal immigrants when they aren't allowed to, they just don't even run the checks. They just pay them with cash, and they pay them with less than minimum wage, so they don't want to hire people legally, and digital ID isn't going to stop that incentive system from operating. Now, Starmer tried to hijack the public's opposition and outrage to this mass illegal immigration that's been destroying our country, and he used it to push through an authoritarian law on digital ID. And frankly, the public just saw right through him straight away, right? Why do I, a Brit born here, lived here all my life, all my family are British, why do I need a digital ID forced upon me so that the government can track me to stop illegal immigrants from getting a job? right? My driver's license isn't enough, my national insurance number, not enough, my passport, my taxpayer identification number, all of that isn't enough. So the motivation for this policy, it takes over and it matters much more to people than the policy itself. The benefits of one easy-to-use ID, digital, on your phone, just like an Apple Pay card for booking an NHS appointment or buying a car, that is actually outweighed by the bad PR from knowing that Starmer is lying about why it exists. There are some advantages to a digital ID. It's just the problem is when Starmer and the Labour Party come into this from an inherently dishonest position, claiming that it's about illegal immigration, all that makes it clear to us is that the real reason for putting this in is nefarious, and it's for tracking us and it's for restricting our abilities for free speech and to operate as free human beings. Now, in that sense, Starmer really does have that reverse Midas touch, and he is entirely typical of the political elite who have come to dominate our politics over the last few decades but are now being thrust out and thrown away, right? He literally has a voice coach who tells him how to speak, right? Guess what? I don't like my voice. I have a little bit of a lisp. When I try and say R's, right, R, it comes out as a W. I hate that, but I'm not going to get a voice coach to teach me how to speak properly because I'm not a fucking politician. Whereas Starmer, on the other hand, speaks only in the way designated by his voice coach. He wears clothes which are picked out by a chief of communications with a degree in power suits from a fake university, right? And he never actually answers a question, yet he always starts every answer with, let me be perfectly clear, right? He is the antithesis of a real human, and he is a politician through and through. And literally everything about someone like Starmer inspires mistrust, distrust, right? It inspires hate within us. Now, funnily enough, I actually think that this is all good news for the UK, right? I genuinely think that, first of all, the failure of that Labour coup by Burnham to oust Starmer is good for the country, and that Starmer is the perfect bad Prime Minister. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we should be kind of thankful that he didn't succumb to that left of Labour coup by Burnham and co over the last few weeks, right? Because Starmer is bad enough that he's causing the support for the Labour Party to collapse, and he's creating the prospect of them winning the next election, catering down to almost zero. And that is following directly the horrific Tory rule that exposed to right-wing UK citizens the existence of the Uni Party and the idea that the Tories aren't actually right-wing. And Starmer is so unpopular that every single media organisation in the country is going against him, causing massive anti-establishment feeling across the entire country. But at the same time, he's powerful enough within the Labour Party, Starmer is, that the left-wingers can't get their coup off the ground and replace him with Andy Burnham, and yet simultaneously, Starmer is weak enough that he can't actually govern as he wants to because his many Labour MPs disagree with his policies too much. So he can't ruin the country beyond repair. This reverse Midas touch that Starmer has is basically the outcome of all of his failures, right? It's his brand and his name and his government that's become so toxic that it has the ability to almost instantly destroy the credibility of any policy, to a point where the only real way he can even govern at this point is to use like secret smoke and mirrors, which he isn't smart enough or competent enough to do, right? He would have to hijack things which are ridiculously popular regardless of his involvement, and then wait until there's huge public pressure to force him to pursue that policy, which then gets an outcome, but it shows him just as weak and doing what the mob tells him to be, right? Or he has to go the other direction and go super sneaky, and he has to use the media and think tanks and his little minions to try and dictate the media's swing and coverage onto something that he is seen as credible with. But either way, right, he is going to have the least enjoyable premiership, and I personally really quite like that. It's going to be tough. He will be exposed as a charlatan, and in the end, it is really looking, in my opinion, more and more likely that we will rid the corruption, the influence of the Uni Party and the political and media elite from our government and finally be a real democracy again, like we were decades ago, where British citizens actually get the country they vote for, not some weird bastardization corrupted beyond recognition. Now, what do I think is the next policy that's likely to be hit by Starmer's reverse Midas touch? Well, my bet here is council tax or stamp duty reform, right? Now, this is something that is desperately needed. It is really regressive, right? Council tax in particular, and stamp duty is just the least popular tax and entirely stupid because it strangles our economy. It makes no sense whatsoever. And the vast majority of British people out there, they recognise that both council tax and stamp duty are broken and that they need to be fixed. Think tanks and the media, they've been talking about it and looking for possible fixes. The Tory party came out and announced that they would just abolish stamp duty altogether. However, in reality, right, any reform to these taxes will almost certainly come alongside an increase in the actual tax rates and the amount of tax that people are paying, right? Maybe those on the lowest council tax bands would be paying the same as before, or only a little bit more, but almost certainly anyone even beyond working class, like even just middle working class or above, they're going to end up paying more from a reform to council tax or stamp duty. And so in the end, yes, a policy like that, while it would be popular for reform and the Tories to announce reform towards those taxes, if Labour do it, it's going to collapse and backfire and make them even less popular. Again, I think that's rather a good thing. I think that we are sort of accelerating the decline of the UK for a period of just a couple of years so that we can then accelerate our escape from that decline when the next election comes around. Personally, I'm really excited to see that. This is a new YouTube channel, as you've probably mentioned. This is the 5th video I've ever made on this channel, so I do want to thank everyone for the support that I've received just from these first few videos. It seems like there's a lot of demand for this kind of content, so I intend to make more of this content. If you have any topics that you would really like me to cover, leave it in a comment down below. Give the channel a subscribe so you don't lose me. The algorithm, I wouldn't be surprised if it decided to punish a channel like mine. So let's try and stay in touch and keep watching these videos, and I'll try to keep putting them out as much as possible and keeping you entertained and informed and rallying against this horrific socialist government. Thank you.